Good morning. And here is Colonial Art in Latin America. This is very much, I think, a complement to the talk I gave 2 weeks ago on Chirurgesque art in Spain and Rococo in Portugal. And we will see how it's very much reflected in colonial art in Latin America. What was colonized by Spain will reflect most of the time the Chirurgesque architecture that actually was much more popular in the New World than it was in the Old World. And then we'll see the delightful Rococo style in many places in Brazil. So, as I know that we are not always remembering all the facts, I have prepared a timeline that gives us a little bit of an idea. I mean, this is really very broad, but give us an idea of some of the main dates. So the construction of what is now Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztecs on the marshland, was in 1325. The first voyage of Christopher Columbus was in 1492 when he first saw the land, which he thought, as you know, that it was India at first. Same year, the Moors and the Jews were expelled from Spain after Ferdinand and Isabella conquered the last last territory that was held by the Moors, which is actually Granada. In 1494, there's the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Pope decides what are the new territories that are owned by Portugal and by Spain. And he really gives that, he slices it in two. And it's decided that this is going to be ruled by Spain and the rest by Portugal. And we'll see a map in a minute. In 1500, Pedro Cabral makes his voyage to Brazil. In 1509 to 47, we have the reign of Henry VIII in England. And then from 1519 to 56, we have the reigns of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor, who is going to be King of Spain as well as Holy Roman Emperor, covering the Austria and is in effect ruling over what is now Germany, as well as the Low Countries and part of Italy, Naples below and Sicily. In 1519, so the same year as when Charles becomes Holy Roman Emperor, Hernan Cortés enters Mexico. In 1532, we have the first sugar mills built in Brazil. This is going to be one of the main source of really revenues for Brazil. It's the sugar, and then we'll see later on mining. 1533, Francisco Pizarro enters Peru. In 1535, the Viceroyalty of New Spain is established. And very quickly, 1539, the printing press is set up in Mexico City. And this is always very important because now you can print books. Let me admit these people. And in 1542, we have the promulgation of the new laws, which is going to establish the way the indigenous population has to be treated by the Spaniards, things that they very quickly are going to disregard, by the way. 1544, the Viceroyalty of Peru is established. And in 1551, you already have royal universities founded in New Spain and Peru. 1556 to 98, that's the reign of Philip II in Spain after his father Charles abdicates in 1556. In 1558 to 1603, we have the reign of Queen Elizabeth I in England. In 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the British. 1565, we're going a little bit backward, founding of Rio de Janeiro. and the Janeiro, sorry, not Janeiro, Janeiro. And 1607, we have the English settlements at Jamestown. This is a good, comparison in dates. The continuation of the timeline gives us foundation of Harvard University in 1636, reign of Louis XIV in France from 1643 to 1715, and then 1759 to 88, the Bourbon reforms of Charles III in Spain. An important date, and we'll see why, in 1759, the Jesuits are expelled from Portuguese Empire and will be very quickly, as you see, in 67, expelled from Spanish America, and the order is going to be suppressed at the same time all over the world. We are now in the period that this course covers, of course, the 18th century. From 1780 and 81, we have the revolt of Tupac Amaru in Peru. 1781, the Comunero revolt in Colombia. And going back a little bit, 1776 to 83, the American Revolution. And 1789, not to 85, to 95, the French Revolution. As you can see, there is now, at the end of the 18th century, we have that century of the Enlightenment, really that push for revolt, for independence from the invaders, if we can say. 1791 to 1804, Haitian struggle for independence. Just a little point, 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar. 1807 to 08, Napoleon occupies Portugal and Spain. 1807-8, the House of Braganza moves to Brazil because because Napoleon is invading Portugal, so the Queen is exiling herself to Brazil and will die actually in Brazil. War for independence between 1810 and 24, 1812, the War of 1812, US-British in Spanish America. In 1822, Pedro I declares the independence of Brazil. So this is a lot of dates, but I think it gives us an idea of what's happening on both sides of the ocean. So here is a map that gives us an idea of the Treaty of Tordesillas, first, this is giving you the idea of the ocean. So the Spanish hemisphere with the sea in red is the Pacific Ocean, and part of the Atlantic Ocean, and they kind of cut Brazil. Brazil comes, of course, much more, within here. But that's about the idea. So most of the possession of Spain from Mexico all the way down to Argentina. This is Spain. And then what we see the other side, the other part of the Atlantic, with some possession around Africa, all around here, all around India, and in the east are going to be for Portugal. So this is very much of a deliberate share of the world between these two. And here's, by the way, the official Treaty of Tordesillas that is held in the museum in Spain. Here to give you an idea that by the time the two are done with the world, this is about what is the empire, a Spanish and Portuguese empire. Excuse me, 2 seconds, but I can't. Sorry for that. So here's the map, and we really have an idea. Look at the small territory originally of Spain and Portugal, and this is what the world looks in 1790. Now let's look at some of the particulars that we find following the invasion and the colonization of these two countries, by these two countries of Latin America. First, big result, and we know that's going to happen also in North America, but the contact between the people from the old world and the new world is going to trigger a whole series of epidemics. And I give you some dates there where we have smallpox with multiple epidemics, typhus, influenza, diphtheria, measles. Subsequent to European contacts, these are going to kill between 10 million and 100 million people, and in some places up to 95% of the indigenous population. With what is left, what is going to be the labor force? So in 1512, the law of Burgos forbade the maltreatment of the indigenous population and endorsed their conversion to Catholicism. One of the early conqueror of Mexico, and prior to Mexico, actually, on the islands in the Caribs, is going to go back and really horrified by the way the indigenous population is treated. He's going to report to the king and the queen, and they're going to come then with the laws of Burgos in 1512. The result of this is we're going to try to find a system to keep control, because that was the whole idea, is to control the population. And they're going to do it in a way, it's called the encomienda of the indigenous population. So they bring many indigenous to work in the fields and in mines in exchange for, in quote, Spanish protection, because of course many of these tribes were fighting against one another. They claimed to provide education and a seasonal salary, but this wasn't, let's say, a hidden word for slavery in a sense. And we'll see how they're going to try to accommodate that in a more humane fashion, particularly protected by some of the orders. Now, because as we've seen with the epidemics, there's been tremendous dying, tremendous loss of life. They need labor, and the way they're going to compensate is to bring in slaves from Africa. And it's going to differ from what they call Spanish America and Brazil. Brazil definitely will have a larger population of slaves. About 4 million of Africans are going to be imported in Brazil for labor in the mines and in the fields and so on, and cut in the sugar canes. In Spanish America, about 2.5 million of Blacks. I was reading some statistics that in fact in Mexico, and you don't feel it when you go to Mexico, but in Mexico, the average Mexican has about 4% of Black genes in their blood. In fact, what happens is that they married, and you end up having what is called mulattos, mulattos being a mix between indigenous and Blacks, whereas mestizos are the white and the indigenous population. Finally, to try to curb that the slavery before it was abolished, they came first with the freedom of the wombs, where the judicial principle in many Latin American countries forbade the enslavement of enslaved people's children at birth. And that was a first step. And of course, then it's by the mid-19th century, slavery was abolished. Now, a very important factor of course, conversion for sure, but also in the whole education system, but also for many in the protection of the population. The religious order, it's very ambiguous in the sense, but Franciscan, Dominicans, and Jesuits, they are other order that came, the Carmelites, and others we'll see later on, the Augustinians, and so came in smaller numbers. But definitely Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits were very instrumental in the social organization, if you want, of the local population. Franciscans arrived in Mexico in 1522 and really worked on the urbanization of the indigenous population. They were very instrumental in the Yucatan, where they were the only one to be able to access to that area. And the way they did it often is by bringing the Mayan youth in their facilities to educate them. These were monastery schools where they were, of course, brainwashed, as you can imagine, until they returned to their village as Christian schoolmasters. The Dominican came to Peru in 1531 and the Franciscan a little later. By the early 17th century, there were 700 Dominicans in Peru and 600 Franciscans. It's a huge number when you think about it, but they, of course, contributed to that whole idea of education. And then the Jesuits came to Brazil in 1549, Peru 1568, Mexico 1572. The Jesuits were expulsed in 1759 to 73, depending on the country. And then they were restored in 1814, and they'll be extremely important in the establishment of a small town that turned into big cities later on. When I mentioned the fact that this is an ambiguous situation, is that on one hand, definitely these orders try to protect the indigenous population against excesses. But they were part of the system and, of course, favorized that whole idea of colonization. So let's look at what we're going to see. I circled in the main centers that we're going to talk about. This is Mexico and Central America. The first we will see is Santo Domingo, which is the third stop of Christopher Columbus. He started in the Bahamas, but didn't stay, went to Cuba. As we can see here, he went along the coast and then ended up in Santo Domingo and Puerto Rico later on. We'll see a map in a minute with his voyages. So in Mexico, we're of course going to talk mostly about everything around Mexico City. And I'm sorry, that's the only city I didn't circle, but there it is. Around it, we have Querétaro, which played a very big role during the revolution. Zacatecas, we have the whole Guanajuato region here with all the mines north of Mexico, and then south of Mexico, Puebla, which is really the heart of Baroque in Mexico. We'll see a few examples in Guatemala, Honduras, and Panama. And then we'll have another map once we talk about South America. Just a little refresher for those of you that have been interested in Christopher Columbus. These are the four voyages that Christopher Columbus did, the first one being in blue, where you see him coming from the south here through the Canary Islands. That's the last place he will do repairs and load all their resources, food, etc. Then went all the way through the Bahamas, Cuba, Santo Domingo before leaving back and going by the Azores Island, Lisbon, and then back to Palo San Lucar. The second trip is the red one, and it departs from Cadiz, again through the Canary Island, which was a good place. This is about a 2-week voyage from there, going through Guadalupe, Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo, went again around the southern coast of Cuba, Jamaica, and then went back here. The third one in green, you see it's about the same, but they touch the northern coast of South America and go on their way down, go through Cape Verde. Then finally, the yellow one, also leaving from Cadiz, goes through the Martinique, touches the coast of Central America, as you can see, and then goes back. So I think that's always interesting to see. And so despite the fact that in Santo Domingo, this church is prior to our period, but I really wanted to mention it because it is the oldest cathedral in the Latin America. And Santo Domingo became in 1498 the oldest European city in the Americas. So this architecture that you see there, that church being started in 1512, is a mixture of a little bit of Gothic, a little bit of Moorish. If you look at the way the frame of the windows shows some Moorish influences, what we call Plateresque, which is that part of the Renaissance typical to Spain. These very sophisticated portions, with the rest of the church being very, very simple. This church is pretty long. It's 177 feet long and 75 feet wide. The interesting thing is that it contained for a long time the remains of Christopher Columbus until they were moved to the Fajoa Colón in the same city, though Sevilla claims also to have the remains. So there is a little dispute there. Could be that the remains were shared between them. So here is the church. As you can see, it's very large, and then shows inside Gothic interior. The altar this has here is that retable is quite remarkable, as it is made of solid mahogany. Moving to Havana in Cuba, we have here the colonial Baroque facade of the Cathedral of La Havana. Also quite a remarkable work with the 2 towers on each side. This is a very large church too. As we said, Christopher Columbus touched Cuba the first time in 1492. And by 1511, the first Spanish settlement was founded by Diego Velázquez de Cuellar. The cathedral itself is influenced by the works of Boccomini. So, and this is where Baroque starts, of course, Boccomini being one of the great Baroque architects in Rome. The largest missionary group in Havana was the Society of Jesus. And so they received the permission to set that cathedral in the center of the city. Moving to Puerto Rico, we're going to look at the very typical colonial style, which is so charming and that we find in many of these countries, but with the balconies and that contrast, the contrast with between the frames typically either in a lighter color stone on a colored background. So thinking of art, after talking so much about history, what made a difference between the Spaniards and the indigenous population, the mestizos? So in Spain, to become an architect, you had to be pretty skilled at design, of course, and be knowledgeable also of the trade of bricklayer, which is called albañil. The architect and master builder being an anarife. So you had categories of workers, but a person would study to occupy one of the three trades. When they moved to Spain, instead of being forced to know one of these, any one of the three trades would make you an architect. And we have a few names that we're going to see quite regularly. It's Lorenzo Rodriguez, Pedro de Arrieta, and Jerónimo de Balbás, particularly very known in Mexico. After 1746, there were ordenanzas that proposed to officially change the construction trade into an art. And so now it was not only being a technician, but also an artist. And this is under the influence, of course, of Europe. But it remained the fact that only a Spaniard could be a master of architecture. As the mestizos and the indigenous population were excluded, what they had to do is attend artist studio lessons. And they were literally taught in studios. Whereas in the big cities, typically only the main architects will get the commission. In small towns, then the mestizos and some of the indigenous population were able to build smaller churches, and often with a tremendous character. So the styles that we encounter, for example, in Mexico is the Mexican chirurguesque, so the equivalent of what we had seen in Spain, that is marked by what we call horror vacui, a hate for anything that is empty. So any little place is always going to be filled with some details. What is really interesting is that the indigenous population are going to turn the chirurguesque into their own art with their own iconography. And this has been a big battle between scholars, that they don't want art made by the indigenous to be called chirurguesque, but rather tequitqui. And this is outside of Mexico City. And they really look at it as an embodiment of the Mexican identity. For example, the use of flowers that for the Indians represented abundance of nourishment, rain, as they were offering it to the god Tlaloc. The representation of water and blood in Mexican architecture and sculpture were not rooted on the Christian imagery, but rather going back to the Aztecs and the Mayas, where with their sacrifices and definitely use of flowers as gifts to the gods. So this is going to be that kind of osmosis, moving from their original religion to one they are more or less forced into, but that they're going to bring in the same type of decor. So to start, of course, we're going to start with the extraordinary cathedral complex in Mexico City, the Mexico City Metropolitan Cathedral, that was built between 1553 and 1813. And then that smaller church built and connected to it directly, which is the Sagrario Metropolitano, that was built between 1749 to 60 by Lorenzo Rodriguez, that architect that we see that came from Spain. And that Sagrario is very much, as you can see, what we would call chirurguesque architecture. The two are connected through an inner chapel. This, of course, that complex was built on the main square of Mexico, the old Aztec place where actually the Great Pyramid, was built prior to the cathedral. What is interesting is a lot of the relief that you find on the Sagrario facade were inspired by Peter Paul Rubens. The Sagrario is constructed of what is called tezontle, which is a reddish porous volcanic rock, and then the white stone that contrasts with it, which is really beautiful. Inside, it has the shape of a Greek cross. I'm not talking as much about the cathedral because it was really built into that earlier Baroque period. And we're trying to focus on the 18th century. And I already had a lot of difficulty keeping the dates to make sense, not to have too much material, of course. And here is a detail of that extraordinary facade of the Sagrario with the estipite columns, which were typical of the second period of Chirurgesque architecture, where it's not the Solomonic column that we have, but in fact these that look more like obelisk than regular columns. And if you look at the details, we already find some golden vegetation and so on that are very typical of what's going to be developed in Mexico. Inside, we have two main altars. There are more than that. Unfortunately, as you know, the cathedral suffered a pretty bad fire in about 50 years ago. So the cathedral is at the interior, has 16 different chapels that are each assigned to a religious guild and therefore to a certain saint. So we look at the two main altars, the altar of the kings on the left by Jerónimo Balbas, who was one of the great sculptor architects in Mexico. And then the same took care of the altar del Pardon that we see on the right. The altar del Pardon, of the pardon, if you want, took its name because they were bringing people during the Inquisition in front of the altar, so they had to apologize for their fault before being executed. But there is also an interesting story that a Flemish painter who came and really founded one of the biggest schools in Mexico had been arrested for some profanation of whatever reason. And while he was in prison, he painted a beautiful image of the Virgin. And it was considered such a magnificent piece that he came and asked for forgiveness in front of the altar, was forgiven, was able to go on painting, but the painting was put in the center. This altar was very much damaged during the fire. And here is the painting by Simon Peredes of the Virgen del Perdón. Beautiful work that's going to be very influential on the indigenous painters. He's really one of, we have both sources in painting. Both we have Flemish painters that came as well as Italian, and they're all going to influence very much the style that's going to come out of it. Another really interesting thing, and I think to me it's important to tell you, though it is earlier, it also dates earlier than the 18th century, but just to show you how the indigenous population kind of worked their way into Catholic religion, despite sometimes the really reticence, if you want, that they're kind of shying away from the Franciscans or the Jesuits because they thought they were lacking respect. But in fact, they were living the way they used to live, and they were adapting to that new religion. So the story of the Lord of the Cocoa Beans is really cocoa. Cocoa has played a very important role in Mesoamerican history. It was not only used for food, but also for medicinal purpose, and also as offering to the gods. And so normally before the European came, they would offer these cocoa beans to their gods and to the Aztec, to their ruler. These were very valuable. So when the Catholics were there and started inviting people to come to the mass and so on, they were horrified because people would come with food and eat during the mass. And so they worked it out that they adapted a sculpture of Jesus. And as you can see, this is Jesus, part of the Passion, where he's been flagellated. He has the crown of thorn. But at his feet are some vessels where the population can come and offer these cocoa beans, which at the time were extremely valuable, and that, of course, the priest would take advantage and resell or use for their own purpose. So this is literally telling you a story of how the ancient Latin American culture was mined with the culture of Spain, but also that new culture was looking at the old culture and adapting it. So let's look at a few other churches in Mexico. This is La Santísima, the Church of the Most Holy Trinity, that was attached to a hospital of the same name. It was built between 1755 and 83. The hospital actually functioned until 1859, but then, as you know, there were reform laws that nationalized much of the church property in Mexico. As you can see, again, we have that very typical Churrigueresque architecture with estipite here on the side, and then you have these very beautiful statues in the middle, typically representing the main figure of the order that it was attached to. And this is the side entrance. Of course, we have to look at the Guadalupe. And this is, by the way, an interesting panorama showing the old Basilica of the Guadalupe, and then the new one that has been built not too long ago. And the enormous crowd that always invades this place. When I went to Mexico, this one wasn't built yet, and you would see people helped by their members of the family literally going on their knees all across that square to enter the church at that time. Because, as you know, Mexico is built on marshland, it's very difficult for these very heavy buildings to stay square, if you want. And the church, as you can see, sinking on the left. And that's why it was decided, not only because it wasn't big enough, but also because of the danger it represented. They replaced it by the very modern building that you see on the left that can accommodate many, many more worshippers. Also, I want you to look at this because we will see in a minute, but this is a good panorama to see it. So this is the little chapel of the Pocito that is in the back of the Guadalupe. Originally, the church was called the Templo Expiatorio a Cristo Rey, has been actually used mostly as the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and kept there the famous original image of the Guadalupe, the Virgin of the Guadalupe, until unfortunately a bomb was planted in a flower vase near the altar in 1921 and made tremendous damage in the interior of the church. Of course, now the image of the Guadalupe is in the new cathedral. Again, we have these very sophisticated, very highly worked central porch. For the rest of the church, it is rather plain. Interesting little building on this upper part. This is supposedly where the apparition happened. This is El Pocito, the chapel of the well, that was begun in 1777. This is the sacred spring on the hill of Tepeyac that overlooks the basilica. As you can see, it has a completely curved exterior and then the convex facade of dark red. Very interesting and unique architecture with patterned tiles on the roof and a large dome. Again, you have a very much Chirigaresque entrance. But then when you come in, you have the beautiful azulejos tiles that are covering the ceiling with some frescoes in between, and multiple chapels all around. It's almost like a small pantheon. It is considered the last Baroque church completed in Mexico, but many look at it as the neo-stilo, the new style of Mexican architecture. Moving outside of Mexico, we're going to look at a few of the marvelous churches that were built around. This is the Church of San Francisco Javier, which is now the National Museum of Viceroyalty and Tepoztlan. It's within the state of Mexico, an extraordinary facade. It's considered one of the most important Baroque facade built in New Spain. And of course, you come in and you have an almost identical retablo within, totally covered with gold and having all these niches with different saints, statues of saints. This is only one of the altarpieces. I had not enough room to put them all. This is the Basilica de Ocotlan in Tlaxcala, the state of Tlaxcala. This is east of Mexico. This is again a really interesting way of the adaptation of the indigenous population crafts onto a work that is originally a European style. As you can see, lots of paintings. There are many painters that came. Painting started really at the early part of the 16th century, and they created their own. They had their own workshop. A whole series of painters in Mexico and in Peru, particularly, we'll see at the school of Cusco. These very often have as a source for the building a miracle that where either Christ or Mary asked for the building of a church, and then the church attracted pilgrims and they needed a bigger church, and then a monastery came. This is definitely a monastery, a monastic church. In Querétaro, I found this map, which is really interesting because they talk about the fact that this is one of the interesting aspects of Querétaro that has kept its original geometric street plan. Originally, most of the cities were planned in that very geometric way, which goes back to the castrum, the Roman castrum, in fact. Of course, with the time, this was changed and the pattern of the streets were changed, but I thought this was an interesting way of looking at the early colonization. In Querétaro, of course, this is where Maximilian got executed. There's a lot of the revolution happened in Querétaro. I'm not going to linger too much on that because that's beyond the scope of the class. But this is the Casa de la Marquesa, beautiful house built in the center of the city. Was built around 1756 and has that again these very pretty molding around the windows, very gracious, curvilinear, a very nice entrance, and then the balconies. You know, you could open the windows and the pretty ladies could look out on the street, and of course the coat of arms of the family. Santa Clara in Querétaro, a very plain facade, but then you come in and here is one of the decoration and you can see the work. This is very typical of indigenous population work with lots of fruits and vegetables and animals, and also the characters, the sculptures and the cherubs show features that are much closer to the local population than what you would have before, where it was more Europeanized. The mining, of course, in Guanajuato, we have one of the beautiful churches that was built thanks to the mining. Guanajuato is a mining state where they were mining silver, gold, copper, and of course made the wealth of the city. And they, of course, had to build a beautiful church. Again, you have that extraordinary porch and an abundance of retable inside, very much in Churrigueresque style. If you look at, or that they, and I forget now the name, take it Cape, the indigenous style with, but the estipite columns are present and a whole series of cherubs and other statues. Also in Guanajuato, in Salamanca, this is in the state of Guanajuato, the Parroquia Antigua, dedicated to Saint Bartholomew, shows again these research for the beauty of the architecture, but also the colorful side of the what the population liked. And here you can see extraordinary decoration for being in the middle of the Mexican landscape. In north of there is the Zacatecas state. This is the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Assumption. Extraordinary. I'm short of words actually to try to explain, but again, that very highly sculpted portico to that church, also known as one of the most outstanding examples of Baroque in Mexico. You have statues of St. James, St. Peter, St. Paul, and St. Andrew. And then here the three levels with different saints at each level. And here you can see, again, a very plain facade beside that and a reproduction in the towers that were built a little later. But as I mentioned before, if you go just south of Mexico City, we have the city of Puebla. And Puebla is known as the center of Baroque in Mexico. And this is the cathedral, though the cathedral is a little earlier. was a little earlier. It burned down and then was replaced with this church that is not particularly Baroque, has some Romanesque look and a rather simple portico, but then you come in and you have a series of chapels, including here the main retablo, the main altar, with large paintings. We have paintings by Cristobal de Villalpando, who is one of the most important 18th century painters in Mexico. Also a side chapel, the Capilla del Ochavo, the Holy Spirit part of it. It's an octagonal chapel with 3 retablos that show, instead of sculptures, here a whole series of paintings, different size, some paintings on copper, some paintings on canvas, a few on wood panel. Still in Puebla, we have the convent church of San Domingo de Guzman. These are the Dominicans, of course, very simple facade. But then you come in and you have here one of the most known works of art, called the 8th wonder of the world at the time. That interior that is absolutely typical of the local and indigenous decoration. Can horror vacui, they fill every single little space they have with either paintings or these very intricate motifs all around. We have to remember too that Puebla is the place where the Talavera tiles are made. This was inspired by what was done, of course, in Spain, in Sevilla in particular, and is going to flourish in Puebla. And so they apply that now to church. And it's a very interesting, I'll let you judge of how you like it, but it's definitely a very interesting aspect of Mexican Baroque architecture with these Talavera mosaics that actually have the color of the Virgin Mary, blue and white, and then Joseph, green and yellow. This is a Franciscan church, as you can see, Church of San Francisco Acatepec, was built in 1650 and all the way to 1750. This is in the province of Puebla in San Andres Cholula. As you can see, the little tower here is still made with different type of mosaics. And here's an example of how it was built. So you can really appreciate that these are all small mosaics that are juxtaposed to give you these interesting patterns. Inside, again, it's incredible. You come in and you're overwhelmed by the gold. Golden moldings, figure made with polychromy, enormous retablo with a crucified Christ in the center, series of little chapel. Even if you look at it, the pulpit is all golden and all the way into the dome. Often the saints and the altarpiece are carved in wood, polychrome, and then also have what is called the estofado, which is where they dress up the sculptures that are going to be taken around for the Holy Week, by the way. But you can see the church, this is really interesting, that often have far more typical features, indigenous features, than they are European. One more of these incredible churches is also in Cholula, the Santa Maria Tonantzintla, 18th century, has also Talavera tiles, but a different scheme of colors on the porch, as well as on the tower. But then that incredible interior that is, again, very typical of the kind of a folksy type of decoration, with a lot of glaze surfaces and glass, different colors, different statues that are in little niches, all surrounded by fruits and flowers. And there are some interesting things. There are dark-skinned angels. Some are blonde hair, blue eyes, and others are dark eyes and dark skin. Um, you have tropical fruits and ears of corn. So, in fact, what you see is that this place used to be a sacred space dedicated to Tonatzin, who was the mother goddess. And of course, the Spanish replaced it by the Virgin Mary. In Guerrero, this is still north of, again, north of Mexico, is the Santa Prisca de Taxco church, with, again, the incredible interior, just an accumulation of wealth and exuberant decor that really corresponded to the desire for the indigenous population was brought in. They wanted to enjoy the kind of things they had seen before. So here, the beautiful Chirurguesque entrance and that's almost decadent in interior. Oh, sorry. I wanted to, when I could see, have some interesting documentation, I bring it out. This has been a lot of research. There's not one book, not one program that comes up. It's enormous research, and sometimes you're lucky to find a lot. So this is the altarpiece dedicated to Santa Prisca and San Sebastian in the church, and where you can see again the stipite columns, different levels. You have statue as well as paintings. But again, you don't have only one altarpiece. Here are 3 others out of the 16 that are in that church. And they dedicated to different saints. This is Christ carrying the cross. Here you have, I think it's St. Michael. And then another, this is the Virgin of the Rosary, with at the bottom something that looks very much like a Byzantine icon. So a really interesting mixture. The paintings that you find in the interior very often are painted by Miguel Cabrera, who was a local painter born in the 17th century and who became pretty famous around. And sorry, my mouse is too sensitive. And he has one more altar with interesting sculptures, because this looks so 17th century European. This is in rock, and the face is so very typical of that. It has nothing even Spanish. And then amazing organ that were decorated in a similar fashion to later on to what existed already around it. So I'm going to show a few more countries, but very quickly. This is the Iglesia de la Merced in Antigua, Guatemala. Again, definitely the architecture is going to be influenced by what is seen in Mexico, though in Guatemala the big problem is earthquakes, and even the capital city had to be moved 4th time before it is what it is now, Guatemala City, but because of earthquakes and floods. So this is one of the churches that resist after a big earthquake that took place in 1773, where the cathedral was in such terrible shape. They had to move not only they had to let the cathedral behind, but move the entire city to another place. Now, when we talk about the church, we realize we have brought in population that are very committed to that church. And they were heartbroken because all the art that was inside that was salvageable, uh, it was decided it was going to be moved to the new church that wasn't built yet. And the population was in absolute disarray um, when they started moving pieces. You can see this is after a picture after a more recent earthquake. As you can see, it happens quite often. But the story goes that when pieces like this Christ of the Passion were moved, people literally walked 15 kilometers. That's 10 miles, carrying these pieces all the way to that other location of the new capital when the church wasn't even built, and it was stored in temporarily in a kind of a cabana. This church had supported the earthquake decently well and was able to house many works of art too. But it's absolutely beautiful, that contrast of the white stucco and the yellow ochre background is really quite beautiful. The same church organizes at the Holy Week, they have procession all around, but also that kind of carpet made of fruits and vegetables and colored sand. That is every year a curiosity, as you can imagine, attracting a lot of people. Now, looking at that church that was still very much influenced by European art, we have to contrast with the very small local churches, such as this one, the San Andrés Hecul, which is built in the end of the 17th century, but is so much part of the folklore of Guatemala. In Honduras, this is the cathedral at Tegucigalpa, and we have a rather moderately ornate porch, but with a beautiful retablo inside. And then in Panama, part of these famous mission of the Company of Jesus, which is the Jesuits, of course. This was a complex where there was a church, a convent, and a school. That, by the way, became the first university in Panama. Was unfortunately destroyed in a fire and later on damaged by earthquakes, but remains, shows really that how beautiful it must have been in this time of glory. So now we're going to take a little break. I'll bring you the map of South America and all what we will see there. And we'll have to hurry because I still have so much. So please unmute yourself if you want to talk and ask questions. Welcome to John. And please.
Hi.
Hi. Just tell me what you think.
Incredible.
Isn't that incredible?
Never seen any of these churches at all, and they're fabulous.
They are.
Fabulous.
Really, this is the time of the most incredible art, and we'll see a lot in South America too. Whereas there are definitely a lot more churches that I can't show because they are 16th or 17th century. I've been cheating a little bit when I think it's really such an example. But what is incredible is you can get into a church, you look at the facade, you say, okay, it's nice. And then you get in and you're just overwhelmed by that gold and all these retables that were built there. And again, it can give you lots of question mark when you know how poor the people were. So no question? Good. Just get yourself a little coffee, and we'll go on very quickly.
Well,
This
and
also makes me feel like, people that talk about Mexicans being, no talent, poor, dirty, uneducated, and you see their heritage. I mean, it's just so unbelievable. I mean, it's so beautiful. And, people
Yeah.
just don't realize that. They don't let themselves realize it.
No, the thing is, I'm sure they have tours, though Mexico is not always considered safe too. But there are some tours where you can go around the Baroque churches in Mexico. And there are many, many more than what I've shown you. I've really tried to select the best.
Joan and I have seen a lot of them. So.
Yeah. Good. But it's a good review.
I just wish I had a better computer screen so I could see these larger. It's really frustrating.
No, but can't you put it on the television as you have done before?
No, I've never been able to do that.
If you have a recent television, you just put an HDMI cable. Somebody has a radio on, I don't know, so be careful. We can hear it. So if you put an HDMI cable between the back of your television to your computer, you can then project on the larger screen.
I think the problem is there isn't room for one. Yeah.
That
Anyway,
could
I'll
be.
get my
I
nerd
don't know
out
how
here.
old your television is, but I know mine must be 5 years old, and it definitely has a few HDMI ports at the back.
Anne,
Yes.
one of the things that absolutely has blown me away is Mexico. I had no idea that they had that kind of church architecture there. It's jaw-dropping.
Oh, it is. And, I'm going to show again, I discovered a lot in Brazil that I had no idea. My point when I decided to make this book was in Mexico and Peru. And then I discovered a whole series. So it's going to be interesting. We'll go on with it. And again, places like Venezuela, forget it about finding any information on Venezuela right now. And all the states, even Colombia, it's not easy. So I'm gonna mute you because somebody has a radio that is really troubling here. So I'm going to mute you all and we'll go on. Okay, so let's go on. And again, here's the map of South America. And we'll start with Peru because it was pretty much the next territory that was discovered by Pizarro. And we'll go around Peru and then we'll go down to Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, not to forget Bolivia, where I found some incredible churches. So let's look at a few maps. This is the way to go to Peru. You had to go through the Isthmus of Panama. Of course, there was no canal at that time. So I'm still trying to find out how they crossed from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And this was done in 1513 by Vasco Núñez de Balboa. Having opened that travel line, if you want, this allowed Francisco Pizarro to come some years later and conquer Peru between 1531 and 33. And if you can see that faint orange light here along the coast, you can see how he came really hugging the coast all the way from the north to come down here. All the way to Cajamarca down here, where he's going to finally meet, he's going to go inland and meet with the Inca and make him prisoner. I'm shortening the story because it's a very long story. From Cajamarca, he heard that there was a lot of gold in a place up as you can see, this is very high relief. So they went all the way down and ended up in Cusco, which at that time was the capital of the Inca Empire. And we'll see Cusco in a minute. So here's Peru, and here's the beautiful cathedral in Lima. Just cleaned up. This is not the way I saw it. And then the very typical, you see the Archbishop quarters next to it with these beautiful balconies, as you can find in many streets in Lima. Unfortunately, again, the church has suffered quite a bit of damages during fires. But the inside is a very, I would say, cold Baroque, nothing compared to what we have seen in smaller churches. So I'm going to take you a little bit around Lima. Lima was, by the way, founded by Pizarro and Almagro, his lieutenant, because they were not interested in staying in Cusco. Cusco, first of all, was extremely high. It's an altitude of 3,400 meters, sorry. So which brings you about 10,000 feet. And so difficult to breathe. The Indians over there have lungs that have got accustomed to the height and the rarity of the oxygen. But what was most important for Pizarro was to have access to the sea. And so they are the one who founded Lima. There was no particular settlement there, but they built Lima from scratch and its harbor, Callao. So Lima, in a sense, is a newer city, but it's really very charming. So within Lima, you can find here the Basilica and Convent of Nuestra Señora de la Merced, which again was part of a convent complex. And we find not the Estipite columns, but here the Solomonic columns that are supposedly copying the one from the Temple of Solomon. Big contrast between the very heavy entrance and the rest that is rather plain. So, the charm in Lima, for me at least, is in the very center you have these palaces. This is the Torre Tagle palace in Lima, with beautiful entrance, but also these balconies that are inspired from Moorish antecedents in Spain, where you have these highly worked balconies that you could open, or you could look from inside, you could spy on what was happening in the street. But it's quite beautiful. Very typically Sevillian in taste. We see a similar there is the Osambela Palace that was built at the very beginning of the 19th century, but with the same type of flavor, still very curvilinear frames of the windows that are Rococo in a sense, in style. Now, here you have, in addition, a tower, and from that tower, the Don Martin de Osambela was watching with a spyglass the arrival of the galleons in the port of Callao. Moving quickly to Cusco, which is, as I mentioned, very high. This is at the sea level, and it never rains in Lima. It's always overcast, but it doesn't rain. But Cusco, of course, much larger than when the Incas were there. But as you can see, it's a kind of a valley. But the valley itself is at 3,400 meters, so very high. And from where the picture is taken, we probably in front of Sacsayhuaman Fortress, which is at 4,000 meters in altitude, 12,000 feet. So this was the capital of the Incas, and just an example of what was done with the architecture, as we've seen all over cultures in the centuries. The Roman destroyed some Greek stuff to show their power. When the Catholic Church came about, the Christian Church, they demolished temples and built churches on top of it. Here, it's similar point is that there were many temples and Indian monuments, including this extraordinary temple that was built to the sun, the god of sun. And here is that very typical ashlar masonry made so known for the Incas construction site, where there is absolutely no masonry in between the stones. The stones are just adapted very carefully to one another with no space in between. This makes it, by the way, very good in case of earthquake. So in case of earthquake, everything moves a little bit but stays together. Whereas if you have some masonry, it can fall apart. So this is a reconstruction on how the temple was looking from the bottom. The interior was entirely covered with gold. So was the outside, apparently, and with the intelligence of the Inca to put the lesser good gold towards the north and the better gold on the south. This was then appropriated, of course, by the religious orders, and a Dominican order was able to build a church on top of the temple, keeping the foundation of the temple still intact. So here you have the monastery of San Domingo with the facade on the street and the other, but here is the whole Inca building. And here is a simpler type of portico. The main church is, of course, the cathedral in Cusco. I'm sorry, but I forgot to put the date there. It was built in different levels, and it has on both sides a small church, a Sagrario, and another church dedicated to some saints, made of stones that were recovered from the Sun Temple. You can see there on the left and on the right, the very typical color and type of stone that was used for the temple. Beautiful entrance again with columns, quite interesting. This was done at the end of the 17th century. And then inside one of the many retablos, this is the central retablo within the church with different paintings of the famous school of Cusco. In Cusco was founded the first real large school of painting that was initiated by an Italian painter that came and very quickly formed a whole system of apprenticeship. And from there came a lot of painters, local painters that formed a real school with very interesting iconographies, but you have St. Michael and St. George and a whole series of saints. Another really pretty church is the Iglesia de la Compañía de Jesús. So it's a Jesuit church, all done with that very, the stone shows very typically, as we have here, lots of iron within the ground, so that reddish overtone. But what I really like too are some of these smaller churches. And this is a church within the Andes, the Iglesia de San Pedro de Andahuaylas. Very strange from the outside, though it has been rebuilt in many ways and protected. They protect the entrance that has frescoes. So they added these walls and the roof to protect it. But when you come in from that rather sober facade, you have some interesting frescoes on both sides that show the two ways to heaven, the difficult one and the easy one. But then you turn around and hold your breath. This is, by the way, 17th century. I shouldn't show it to you, but I couldn't not. Oh, you see, I don't want you to see. And here is the interior of that very kind of innocuous church that you saw from the outside, and then you come in and it's debauch of gold and painting. It was actually at the time called the Sistine Chapel of the Andes. Many paintings all around by the painters of the School of Cusco, and then the whole decoration of the ceiling with the beams, and then the large retablo at the end. In Julie, this is close to the Lake Titicaca, is this church, the Church of San Juan de Letran, and this means St. John Latran. And then the inside, again, abundance of paintings, again, the School of Cusco, and then the retablo. And turning around is the continuation of the beautiful paintings with great frames, by the way. North of Lima is the Church of Our Lady of Mercy in Cajamarca. So this is the city where the Inca was made prisoner. And a very elaborate portico to get into that, that church. This is actually one of the first of the Baroque architecture in the Viceroyalty of Peru around 1630, but then was not finished before the 18th century. San Juan Bautista in the Yanahuaja district. This is down close to Arequipa in the southern part of Peru. And again, tons of churches in Peru, but many don't fit in the dates that was allocated. So moving north very quickly, I just want to show you in Ecuador, the Iglesia and Convento de San Francisco, so Church and Convent of San Francisco. And of course, at that time, Ecuador was part of that big empire of Peru. And inside that convent, the extraordinary retablos. What is interesting is that in Europe, the Franciscan churches were supposed by the rule of Franciscans to be very sober and unadorned. So this is a word that got dropped in the water, I think, on the way to the New World. Moving south of Peru, we have Chile with the large cathedral in Santiago that was built in the later part of the 18th century. The interior is a very typical Baroque, columns and so on, but rather grayish. Santiago is an extremely European city. When you go there, you feel that you are back into Europe. And the church, I think the flavor of the church is very similar. Sometimes I like the smaller church in the surroundings more than the large monuments. So I bring you one interesting smaller church south of Santiago. This is on almost an island along the coast, is the Iglesia de Achao. It's on the Quinchao Island, largest town. It's made of wood, and then very interesting ceiling, I think, with the choice of color, but all these ribs that are crossing one another are extremely interesting. Moving inland and north, we go to Bolivia. This is one of the Chirogueresque church that we can find in Potosi. But again, here we have the mixture of the Mestizo Baroque portal, where we find, if we could look close, a lot of these floral and fruit type of decoration that are typical of the mestizos art. But it is here that I can address the very interesting point of some of the work of the Jesuit, particularly the Jesuit. It's the missions. The Jesuit did a lot of missions. So did the Franciscan, by the way. But at that period in time, it was really the Jesuits. And this is showing Bolivia with, see, the border with Brazil, exactly here, but can be literally for us expanded all the way down into Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and Bolivia. There is a whole series of missions that are called the reductions. Literally the Indian reduction in the Andes that are mostly present in Peru, Bolivia, but also Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. And these were actually part of the remaking of society, starting in Peru, where they try to, in a sense, it's kind of using the infrastructure made by the Incas and transform it into an infrastructure pleasing the Spaniards. In doing so, they were trying to put the population together in some small entities. And by that way, be able to educate them, convert them, use them for labor. And it was an easier way to control altogether. So here you see with the cross, the different mission that existed in Bolivia at that time. And I think you're going to be flabbergasted by the type of church they did in Bolivia. By the way, the Jesuits then went on with that idea of reductions, the same way as it was organized by the Spaniards. But their goal was actually to protect the population. In organizing these around the churches and so on, they often prevented the population to be taken into slavery or having to be part of the encomienda. So here are these incredible churches that I discovered in Bolivia. There are many of the same styles, all part of that Jesuit reduction. So all made of wood and then with incredible, this very beautiful decor at the front. To me, I was transported to, in a sense, Norway. Some of the churches over there, I couldn't believe that this was in Bolivia with the campanile on the side. And this is another one, the San Miguel de Velasco. This one, I was able to see the interior where the others were not very little published, but hold on your breath. And this is the interior with these extraordinary columns made of wood, and then all frescoes all around on the walls, and beautiful retablo. And here is the retablo that you would never guess exists when you see the outside of the church. Again, we have St. Michael, St. George, Mary, baby Jesus. And to give you an idea, here's a detail of the center with St. Michael, with his extraordinary triple sword and all the cherubs all around. Moving down, okay, moving to Brazil, extremely large country, as you know. Won't stay too long. This is what used to be the cathedral in Rio de Janeiro. The land, as you know, was claimed for the Portuguese Empire in 1500. with the arrival of the Portuguese fleet commanded by Pedro Alvarez Cabral. The difference that we find in Brazil is that they didn't meet an empire. They didn't meet the Aztecs, or they didn't meet the Incas. There were lots of Indian population, but that were all in small entities and that were fighting most of the time between themselves. So they didn't encounter the same type of resistance, if you want, and power that existed in the others. This is the old cathedral. The new cathedral is a very modern building, but I wanted to show it to you, not so much for the exterior, which is a typical big city architecture, if you want, but I really like that interior, which is much more Rococo, as you can see, with that lot of gilding and white. Very pretty interior of that church. Brazil, by the mid-16th century, was enjoying the cultivation of cane sugar. This was the biggest Brazil export, and slaves. The slaves that were purchased in sub-Saharan Africa and was brought from Angola and Mozambique to cope with the plantation of sugarcane, because again, the population died because of all the diseases brought by the men of the old world. So a lot of slaves, we said 4 million Black slaves were brought to Brazil. By the end of the 17th century, the sugarcane exports began to decline. And then there was a discovery of gold, and by what they call the Bandeirantes, that would become part of the new backbone of the economy of Brazil, literally caused a Brazilian gold rush. And so this is into that mining and so on that we will discover some of the most beautiful architecture. So before getting there, this is still in Rio, the São Bento Monastery, very innocuous when you look at it from the outside, but inside is just overwhelming by its gold and the richness of decoration, wealth of decoration. Just in between, this is about halfway between Rio and Sao Paulo, is that little church that I really want to bring up. It is an 18th century church. And this is in the church of Nossa Senhora do Rosário dos Homens Pretos e de São Benedito. John, I hope you forgive my terrible Portuguese accent, but this was a church that was made by Black people that were used to build the larger churches, but had no churches to go and worship. And so they built that very churches themselves for themselves. And apparently they smuggled a little bit of gold and were able this way to do something for themselves. And that very small church, you come in and it's absolutely delightful inside. Not a lot of gold, but just very delicate decoration. And they worship two of the Black Black saints that were their patrons, in fact. São Benedito e São João. Moving to Salvador in the state of Bahia is the Church of São Francisco that starts showing us some more Rococo style, a lot of curvy linear form. We're now not looking at Spain anymore, so forget about the Churrigueresque. We have to look now at the Rococo style that we find in Portugal in the 18th century. Not so much the inside, but the outside is going to be much more elegant and gracious. Now, as I said, don't forget, you look only at the outside, and once you open the doors, This is what you find. And that incredible interior again, with lots of sculpted wood, glass decoration, gold, colors, not one space without any decoration. Even the coffered ceiling is all painted, as you can see. This church have the largest number of azulejos, 55,000 tiles than you find in any other church. And you can see the azulejos around the altars and around the other chapels too. Now moving to a smaller town that is part of the the Minas Gerais, which is part of the mining region north of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. This town was considered really one of the centers for mining, and did extremely well until the end of the 18th century, where it declined. And so it very much remained not only with the churches, but also the houses as an 18th century town in an extraordinary landscape. As you can see, the mountains all around. This is Ouro Preto. And it's really considered one of the prettiest town in Brazil. Mining, everything. You had gold and silver and hematite, dolomite, tourmaline, pyrite, topaz. And it is the only place in the world where you find the famous imperial topaz, which is that pinkish colored topaz. So let's look at only a few of the churches. You can see there are lots of churches in that town. They're absolutely delightful. As you can see, the shapes are so gracious. It's round, it's pretty, it's light. Columns and details, broken pediments. Small towers or no towers. We'll see different type. They often are designed and built by Antonio Francisco Lisboa. It's called also Aleijadinho. That's his name. But I just felt completely in love. I didn't know this at all. You have here the decoration on top of St. Francis getting the stigmata. But just a beauty of proportion, of lightness, of delicatesse of color. And here's the details of all the cherubs and the garlands and the fruits and everything. And the coat of arms of whoever. And then you have some corn and some leaves. Very highly ornated, but with restraint, I would say. Inside, decoration by Mestre Ataide, the glorification of Our Lady among musician angels. With columns, you have the whole idea of the trompe-l'œil, where you believe that all this is going up when, you know, it's pretty much of a flat surface. Sorry, why is that not? But also beautifully sculpted altars and retables, with this time no gold, just the beauty of the wood. So these would be there would be similar ones on the other side. But as I said, there's tons of these churches in Ojo Preto. Oh, sorry, this might not. Two more that you can see, different churches, depending. The one on the right is a Carmelite church. The one on the left is, I think, a Franciscan church. But again, that absolutely good sense of proportions and just fitting in the surroundings extremely well. This one is even, I think, prettier. It's almost a circular church, again dedicated to the Virgin of the Rosary. And inside you have azulejos and pretty side chapel. This is what used to be the jail and is now the Museum of the Inconfidencia. Which was the center actually for the, no, it's a history museum dedicated to those who died in a failed rebellion movement for Brazilian independence from Portugal. But again, we have the same very pretty curvilinear shapes around the windows and double staircase going up, and then the whole balustrade on top. In another small city not far from there, Mariana, sorry. I'm gonna try not to jump. There we are. Two churches that these are both monastic churches, so their monastic buildings are behind. Are the Church of Our Lady of Carme, the Carmelites, and then the church dedicated to Saint Francis of Assisi. They on the same square, and apparently talking to a friend of mine who is Brazilian, he told me that they both have been recently rehabbed inside. They were falling apart. They restored the interiors and even restored the organs that existed in both of them. This was not paid by the Brazilian government, but rather by some German sponsors. So Mariana is another of these towns that have these typical late Baroque architecture, more Rococo, and just adorable. Now, a large sanctuary in the same state of Minas Gerais in Congonhas is the sanctuary of the Good Jesus of Matosinhos. That church that you see at the back is part of a whole complex. So not only do you have the church, very complex staircase with statues of prophets all around, but then you have a whole series of little buildings that you have to normally pass by on your way to the sanctuary, and that are dedicated to different times of the Passion of Christ. This is, by the way, something that exists in Italy too. In Lombardy, you have some similar settings with different station, if you want. It's not the Station of the Cross, really, but these chapels with, as you will see, extensive sculptural program inside. But it's absolutely beautiful. It's directly influenced. Here is the church, by the way, and you can see all the statues of the prophets around it. As you can see here, Isaiah. It is inspired by one of the churches we saw last time. Sorry. In close to Braga, which is also the church of Bom Jesus do Monte this time. And in this one, you don't have small buildings, but you have to go all across the staircase with different motifs of the senses and different other themes before you come to the church, and then finished within the church, you have the great image of Christ crucified with the two thieves, and a whole series of very naturalistic representation of Mary and John and different actors of the Passion. So inside the church, here is what you find, very Rococo decoration, beautiful. You have a Christ that is inspired by another Christ existing in Matosinhos in Portugal that would look like this. And so it's very much inspired by it. Both considered miraculous images. And you can see the ceiling with lovely frescoes. Though it's not real frescoes because it's on wood, so it's more kind of a work on wood. But then in these little buildings that I showed you around are some of these sculptures that are supposed to have been sculpted by Alejandro, also considered his masterpiece. And you have from upper left, the Christ in the Garden of Olives, the arrest of Jesus on the right, and then down below, Jesus carrying the cross, and then the crucifixion with, again, very realistic, as you can see, very representative of the narrative of the Passion for the population that would come there. In Pernambuco, in Olinda, is another of these small town with beautiful work. This is the oldest Franciscan convent in Brazil. As you can see in the back, you have the ocean. In the exuberant nature, the palm trees, of kind of plants and nature that we know around here, but probably with more rain than we do. These, by the way, along the coast suffered from the time where there was a kind of a power vacuum in Portugal. The Dutch tried to seize Brazil. And so a lot of these monuments got damaged by the Dutch invasion, and many had to be rebuilt. In Olinda, so the same city, you have the monastery of Saint Benedict. Pretty picture, actually. And again, all these very elegant motifs that you find in beautiful interior. This time we're back to gold. In Recife, this is the Church of Our Senora, and it's something to do with the militaries. I'm sorry, but I had a lot of difficulty finding information, but just extraordinary interior, and definitely militaries gather here often. So beautiful main altar and extraordinary decoration in the ceiling. João Pessoa, this is the church, also dating from the mid-18th century. Was part of a Carmelite convent. In Cachoeira, and sorry again for the accent, I couldn't find any information of it, but I just love the beautiful decoration around the doors and the windows, and then on the top, reproduced here on the top. In Salvador, we have the church dedicated to the Third Order of the Carmelites, with a very interesting interior, all blue and gold, so very Rococo in spirit, and then the dressed statues of Christ and Mary. Many of these churches, by the way, were ravaged by fire and rebuilt in the 18th century for that reason. and another one in Salvador, or a Lady of the Rosary. Now, I talked to you about the missions, and this is a series of where you see the cross. These were the mission, the Jesuit mission in that southern part of Brazil. And I can show you
You can also try spelling.
one example here of that mission that was unfortunately destroyed. When the Jesuits were, exiled, sent away, of course, there was nobody to take care of that. Sometimes it started the city, but the mission itself fell apart. And then there was also always these, in the 19th century, at the time of the small revolution, that anger against the church. In Paraguay, which is just next to that one, is an example, for example, of, again, a Jesuit mission. The church would have been the largest church in South America at the time. It was huge. The Jesuits were expelled from Paraguay in 1767. And this was built as a replica of the Church of St. Ignatius of Loyola in Italy. So quickly now we're going to Argentina, showing a couple of examples in Buenos Aires. This is the town hall, the early town hall of Buenos Aires, the Cabildo as they called it, that was built and rebuilt because being too small, because catching fire, etc. But this is now kind of a museum in Buenos Aires. The cathedral that has a story of multiple rebuilds, ended up with a very neoclassical facade in the early 19th century, though the building itself inside is typically Baroque. But in Buenos Aires, there are a few of churches that are more typical of the late Baroque. This is Our Lady of the Pillar, built in 1732 in one of the neighborhood in Buenos Aires, with a very pretty inside, but much more tame, a lot of white with a large retable at the end. This is one of the oldest retables in Buenos Aires. And the statue of the Virgin in the center, carrying baby Jesus. And again, we're talking about the mission. This is extraordinary mission. This is founded in 1610, but was under attacks of the Portuguese Bandeirantes in 1632, and then finally rebuilt in 1696. That mission had a population of around 3,000 people, mostly indigenous population, and they produced cultural and handicraft products that were sold to the Spaniards. So after the suppression of the Society of Jesus in 1767, the Jesuits left the mission, but then the Luso-Brazilian forces destroyed the mission in 1817, as well as all the other missions around. But this one has been now really maintained, is considered one of the treasures in Argentina. And here is a detail, as you can see, the beauty of the carving of the stone. And here it's really interesting because we do have the plan on how it would have worked. And so you can understand these reducciones. would have been, you had the church, what you just saw now, and then a big patio of the cloister with the different cells for the Jesuits. But then this is where the indigenous population would live. You would have, as a tree, I'm trying to find the tree. You would have somewhere around there, you would have the town hall, and you had this cemetery here in this area, and the sacristy and the baptistry, and you had a school, you had a refectory, common kitchen, you had a jail, and different type of things, but that made life safer for the indigenous population and pretty independent from the Spanish power. When the Jesuits, of course, left, these very often fell apart, but it was almost like looking for a better world. So I hope you've discovered with me these incredible churches, and hope to see you in not 2 weeks, it's going to be 3 weeks, to look at the ideology and neoclassicism in Europe. We're going back to Europe, and I think I'm dazzled by what I have seen in Latin America. So let me stop the recording.